Regina Elwell. I'm a member of the FireEye's TOR Advanced Practices team, specifically in adversary pursuit. Prior to that, I was a Mandiant consultant, actually investigating incident response engagements, and more or less became a subject matter expert on financial crime and FIN7. So.
Nice, and I'm Katie Nichols. I work for the MITRE Corporation. I assume everyone's pretty familiar with FireEye by now, but if you're not familiar with MITRE, it's a nonprofit that works in the public interest, doing work for government agencies as well as cool research and development projects like MITRE ATT&CK, which is what brings me here today. My background, I've been on the ATT&CK team for about 3 years, and my background's in security operations centers and threat intel as well. So it's pretty exciting for me as MITRE to be here partnering with Regina to talk to you about how, regardless of the framework you choose, there's value in mapping your threat intel to it, right? So if it's MITRE ATT&CK, the attack lifecycle, we think there's value. So we're going to explain to you why, and then deep dive into FIN7 to kind of show how you can make that actionable. So agenda, what we're going to cover today, we'll start off talking about what I just said, why use frameworks for threat intel. We think there's value there, so why do we think that? Then we're going to introduce you to the frameworks that are near and dear to our hearts, MITRE ATT&CK for me, the attack lifecycle for Regina, and then we're going to talk about how they complement each other. This is a question I know I've gotten so often on the MITRE ATT&CK side. Can I use other frameworks? Yes, you can. It's going to be OK. We'll break it down. Then Regina's expert in FIN7. She's going to introduce you to them and give you an overview of their attack lifecycle. And then we're going to deep dive into TTPs. This is the technical track, right? So we're going to deep dive into the malware and behaviors that FIN7 has shown. And as we do that, map that to lifecycle phases as well as MITRE ATT&CK to show how they complement each other, like we said. So
why use a framework? So at a very basic level, any framework provides a structure for information and knowledge. One of the most basic things that you can see once you enumerate all the information that you have in an intelligent way is the gaps in the knowledge that you have. What's missing? Where are my black boxes? How can I interpret this data in a different way? What's going on?
Exactly. In addition to looking at your gaps, it also gives you a way to compare adversaries to each other, right? Sometimes you have this pros report, like on FIN7 versus FIN8. A little tougher to compare them, but if you divide it into a life cycle phase with the attack techniques, easier to do that one-for-one comparison across groups. And similarly, a comparison from groups to your defenses. If you're really great on certain techniques or phases, you can map that to the group behavior. So we talked about some of the frameworks. Let's introduce you to them. So first off, MITRE ATT&CK. Simply stated, attack is a knowledge base of adversary behavior, or a framework for describing what adversaries do. A couple key things. We base it on real-world observations. The whole idea is behind threat intel, I think, is that you prioritize based on what you know adversaries are doing, right? That's a key component of attack. We base it on what adversaries do or what cutting-edge red teams do that we suspect adversaries are going to pick up. It's also free and open. Anyone can use attack, a student, a vendor, an end-user SOC. It's also community-driven. We at MITRE don't see all the adversary behavior. FireEye, other companies, private researchers, they see the adversaries in the front lines, so we rely on blog posts, tweets, people telling us what adversaries are doing to contribute back to MITRE ATT&CK, and then we can make it better for the whole community. We also see it as a common language. So as we talked about, the value of a framework, this is it, right? We all describe adversary behavior in such different ways, and that can be complicated and confusing if you're reading different reports. This gives you a central place to look and say, I'm talking about this attack technique, and the whole community can use it. A couple components to attack. Up there is what we call the adversary lifecycle, another version of the attack lifecycle, another version of the kill chain, whatever you call it. Adversaries do things, they prepare, and then they compromise your environment. So pre-attack covers before they've compromised you. How do they collect information about your organization? How do they set up infrastructure? And then enterprise attack, which is what many people are familiar with, covers that initial access, and then how they move laterally, exfil information, all that. And separately, we also have mobile attack, which covers Android and iOS, kind of a different landscape. So many people are familiar with a matrix view of attack, so I wanted to break that down for you. Across the top, in enterprise attack, we have 11 what we call tactics, the adversary's technical goals, things like lateral movement, initial access, exfiltration. An important point about this, it differs from the attack lifecycle, is that we don't order these tactics, right? They're roughly an initial access on the left, command and control on the right, But within that, we recognize adversaries will move around amongst them, so we don't give a strict order. So those are tactics, the goals, and then under each of those tactics, we have what we refer to as techniques, how the goals are achieved. So, for example, persistence is a tactic. A scheduled task is a technique example. Diving down, you can probably guess what's next. Persistence, or procedures, sorry, the other P. So within those scheduled tasks, this adversary group uses scheduled task X, Y, Z, and that's an example of procedure, the specific technique implementation. So that's MITRE ATT&CK, breakdown of that.
So the targeted attack lifecycle is another framework. Attackers,
You're good.
as attackers is a framework to provide all the information in the attacker lifecycle from initial compromise all the way to complete the admission. Through thousands of investigations, we found that this structured sequence of events is the typical sequence of events for attacks. So it's more than just our thought. It's backed up by time and time again of thousands of uses. And this is the basic use. So by applying information to this targeted attack lifecycle, we're able to see that general flow of that attack. So.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's a key point. As we talk about how these two frameworks can complement each other, they're different, right? So they have strengths and weaknesses. So the attack lifecycle, there's order to it, right? As Regina said, she and others at Mandiant have so much experience in what adversaries do. They generally follow these stages. So if you're looking for something that puts what they're doing in order, cool, the attack lifecycle might be for you. If you're looking for something that breaks down the techniques adversaries are using at a really granular, structured level, maybe MITRE ATT&CK would work best for your use case. But think about the use case, and you can use both of them. So we wanted to map the enterprise attack techniques, or tactics, rather, to the attack lifecycle. So first off, some of these are really obvious, right? Initial compromise, initial access. Established foothold, we consider that probably our persistence tactic, with persistence extending to maintaining a presence, just different parts of the life cycle. Escalating privileges, yep, that's pretty obvious. Internal reconnaissance, we call that discovery, potato, different words for the same thing, right? Lateral movement, easy. And then completing mission, we consider that probably as the adversaries collect and exfiltrate info and attack. So then you notice there are 11, right? Where are the rest? Some of the attack tactics just don't map to one life cycle phase, right? And that's what I think throws a lot of people off. These things are inherently different, and that's okay. So the ones that sort of map across the life cycle are things like execution, defense evasion, command and control. That happens as adversaries bring tools at different parts of the life cycle, right? And command and control. So credential access happens during lateral movement, happens as persistence, a lot of different parts of this. So the key takeaway here is that MITRE ATT&CK and the attack lifecycle are different, but they don't have to be in conflict with each other. You can use both depending on your use case, and if there's one thing you take away from today, I hope that's it.
So introducing FIN7. If you aren't familiar with FIN7, they're the most prolific financial threat actor of this decade. They've been active since late 2015 and FIN7-related activity continues to be active post the indictment of 3 prominent FIN7 members by the FBI earlier this year. FIN7, obviously, they're financially motivated, and their primary objective is point-of-sale compromise with specific attention in point-of-sale infrastructure to facilitate the collection and exfiltration of payment card data. They're going after your credit cards in most cases. FIN7 is professional, and they use very convincing spearphishing campaigns with customized lures for that primary malware distribution vector. So FIN7 also is super professional, and they have an amazing development lifecycle that we see through a rapid development and changing of their tools and tactics to suit the needs of the environment that they're in. So applying what we know about FIN7 to the targeted attack lifecycle, this is what we get. You take all the information, you apply it to the framework and the structure, and you can start seeing what gaps are we missing, where are they in the process, what do they do for initial compromise, What do they do to escalate privileges and move about the environment? One of the biggest takeaways here, I think, is that by looking at the information in this way, you start to see bigger picture things. FIN7 has minimal use of exploits. They have no known use of 0 days. They use a combination of publicly available tools and then custom tools, and then others that are just like slightly modified. So taking what we know about FIN7, we're going to deep dive on some of these tactics, specifically and purposefully skipping over some of the more common ones like Cobalt Strike or Mimikatz Metasploit, or you just had a big long presentation of Carbonax. So we already deep dived there. So we're going to focus on some of the lesser known or kind of unique things for FIN7. So spearphishing, so that initial compromise and that initial infection vector, we see FIN7 specifically use target spearphishing campaigns with these customized lures to infiltrate an environment. We see weaponized Word docs with those malicious VBA macros. We see link files, launch VBA code embedded within the document contents. We see embedded OLE objects containing the malware. So multiple different techniques in those malicious attachments in order to achieve their objective of getting into the environment. So one of the really, I don't know, special things about FIN7 is their ability to use social engineering to encourage a response to these spearphishing documents. They don't just cold call. We've seen FIN7 take the time to build a rapport with their victim, to actually get to know them, have a back and forth, a conversation before a malicious document is introduced into the environment. We often see malicious documents accompanied with a telephone call to follow up to further encourage the use to open that piece of malware. And then another way that we've also seen is the malicious documents that contain actual instructions on how to enable macros or active content in order to take one step further for their campaign to be successful. So.
Cool, so now we're gonna attackify the slide. I joked on Twitter that I do this mentally as I'm reading threat reporting. I'm like, that's an attack technique, that's one. So we're gonna do it for you here. So spearphishing with attachment, I know Kevin Mandia said earlier, like 91% of all of your engagements involve some type of spearphishing, so that has to be a technique. Next up, scripting, you know, VBA macros, we track macros as scripting. We put OLE, I like to say OLE because it's fun, under dynamic data exchange, very closely related. And then, of course, social engineering, that user execution. FIN7 and so many other groups rely on that, so we have to have that as an execution technique.
So some mitigation and detection techniques. So user training, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention this. It's very, very important. However, FIN7 in particular is really, really good because they specifically target customer service components of organizations, and their victims are people that would in their normal day receive these types of communications from the general public or any type of unsolicited attachment. So it's very difficult in order to mitigate this type of attack with just user training, because the people that they're targeting are people that would in their normal day-to-day job open these things. But it's still really, really good to keep that suspicion up and that type of information. So don't just rely on this. There are other tools and things that you can couple that type of training with. Email filtering, application whitelisting, using, for the users that are in these types of roles, it may make sense to like isolate that system or those user creds in order to kind of keep them separated and black boxed from other parts of the organization for that. So. We also talk about using a GPO to block execution of macros. So even if they follow those instructions and enable those macros and like try their darndest, maybe you can thwart this effort by having that GPO in place that isn't going to let them execute. So.
Yeah, exactly. So in addition to those mitigations, we also wanted to focus on detection, just in case, you know, there's like finance people who are like, I need my macros to do my job or whatever. So create analytics to try to detect this. Use behavioral analytics that if people are clicking on these attachments, executing the macros, try to catch it. This is something, you know, we say a lot. and a suggestion we give for detecting attack techniques. So an example here would be create an analytic looking for win words, spawning things like cmd.exe, wscript, or PowerShell. Again, not going to always be bad. It might sometimes be an admin doing something weird. You know, like Kevin Mandia said this morning, so much of what adversaries are doing blends in with real user activity, real admin activity, but you can start to filter, look for frequency, look for those anomalies, and it might get you somewhere.
Okay, so moving from that initial compromise to establishing a foothold. So one of FIN7's backdoors that they use is HALFBAKED. And this has several components. So backing up to your spearphishing document, it has some sort of payload. Often, in cases, it is a payload such as HALFBAKED. So you have that dropper from your VBA macro and your malicious Word doc that you're determined to open with those instructions. And it drops an installer and a backdoor on the system. So you have a VBA installer that installs that backdoor as a persistent service. And then that VBA backdoor typically has capabilities such as reverse shell, execute shell commands, the ability to upload and download files, the use of WMI to collect reconnaissance details. We've seen additional different modules of HALFBAKED that allow it to do screen capture, the ability to update itself, definitely different types of modular components of HALFBAKED.
Cool, so attack techniques, again, scripting for the VBA macros. New service, really commonly used persistence technique that HALFBAKED uses. Have a command line interface technique for execution, of course. Uploading and downloading files, something adversaries really commonly do. We track that as remote file copy. And then, of course, WMI.
So detection and mitigation of HALFBAKED, implementing those least privilege models for domain users. So if they don't need admin rights, don't give them admin rights. And just because I say I want and need admin rights doesn't mean that I actually need those for my day-to-day use. Putting that in place is very, very important in order to at least stop these attacks from moving further. So.
And again, okay, your mitigations don't work, your domain users insist on being local admin, cool, let's also try to detect this, assuming the possibility that this could be running on our systems. So another type of analytic, monitoring service creation through command line invocation. If you're collecting that command line data, that's a wealth of information you can use. Again, looking for low frequency services. If you have a fairly locked down enterprise, there should be certain software you know about, right? And those services are known. And if there are weird ones that pop up, look for those. Also looking for WMI connections in your network traffic, and then in that same command line data, looking for WMIC in there, seeing if there are any anomalies in that.
Okay, so sticking in our established foothold area, another different backdoor that FIN7 uses is BELLHOP. So BELLHOP is a JavaScript-based backdoor. And we've seen, so BELLHOP gathers basic host information and then downloads a base64 encoded basically blob of JavaScript. And then it sets persistence in 3 different ways for this JavaScript blob. So 2 different registry run keys, which is a common persistence mechanism, as well as creating a persistent named scheduled task. So again, another pretty common persistence mechanism. What makes BELLHOP super cool and interesting is that it communicates using HTTP and HTTPS with primarily benign sites, such as Google Docs and Pastebin. So it uses this communication medium for its beacons, for logging information, and even to download additional payloads. So it's really cool that it does use those common sites.
Cool for them, bad for us, right?
Yeah.
So a couple of techniques here. System information discovery. When adversaries get on those systems, right, they need to do some reconnaissance. They need to figure out where they are, what that system has. We track those under discovery techniques. Persistence, registry run keys. Interesting thing, I hadn't heard of adversaries using run once keys, so that was sort of a good education for me looking at FIN7 here. Scheduled task, Regina mentioned, really common persistence method. We track an attack under the C2 tactic, standard application layer protocol for things like HTTP, dividing that from like non-standard or non-application layer protocol. We have a specific technique for web service. We see more and more malware, right, using Google, Pastebin, Twitter. I think Microsoft TechNet even, someone put a C2 dropper on that because it blends in, right? It looks normal, so adversaries are going to do that. So detection ideas for BELLHOP, again, using that command line stuff, vir, system info, dir. If you see a lot of these executed in quick sequence, that might be something bad. Might be just an admin or like a student seeing like, hey, what commands can I run? But again, filtering out those admins, filtering out those known things and looking for those anomalies that might bubble up. Also monitoring for weird registry run keys. Don't correlate with known software in your enterprise, another thing that we'd highly recommend doing. And also limiting privileges. We've said that a few times now, right? Only authorize your admins to create scheduled tasks. So if your adversary just has user permissions, they can't do it, right?
And then configuring event logging for scheduled task creation and changes by enabling that Microsoft Windows Task Scheduler operational event logging. So specific for BELLHOP, we mentioned that it uses a named scheduled task, and one of those names is syschex. So a specific named scheduled task that you can look for in your environment.
Yeah, and so maybe that will help you detect BELLHOP, but it might not, and that's why we recommend looking for those low-frequency ones in case they change it up, right? Maybe they'll get lucky, though.
So still staying in that established foothold area, PowerSource and TextMate are the next backdoor we're going to discuss here. So PowerSource is a heavily obfuscated and modified version of the publicly available DNS text ponage tool. So I think here is a good example of how FIN7 uses a tool that's already available out in the world and for their own purposes. They've obfuscated it, they've modified it for their own purposes, but why reinvent the wheel when they can already start with a tool that exists? So PowerSource is installed in the registry, again, with those run keys for persistence and in alternate data streams. We also see, so it's used for, uses DNS text requests for that command and control component. Along with PowerSource is TextMate. So TextMate is observed being downloaded often from PowerSource. And it's often never hits disk, so I hate the whole fileless thing, but it's dynamically executed directly in memory via PowerShell, so it never really is there directly on disk as a file. And it too also implements reverse shell via these DNS text commands. So.
It's funny because fileless was also a trigger word for me, but there was recently a tweet, I think Microsoft released a great fileless framework that you should take a look at. Yeah. So looking at attack techniques for these, obfuscated files and information, sort of a generic attack technique, but covering a lot of different ways, invoke obfuscation and other things adversaries do. Registry run keys again, and we track ADS under NTFS file attributes. That's where the ADS data would go. The command and control, again, standard application layer protocol for DNS. And then we divide and attack ports and protocols, right? Because we want to capture when adversaries are using uncommon ports or non-standard ports for that protocol. Moving right along, PowerShell. We have to have PowerShell as a technique, right? Everybody uses it, new hotness, or rather old hotness, because I think it's a few years ago old now. And then again, command line interface for the reverse shell, and standard application layer protocol, and commonly used port for 53.
So one of the big detection techniques or mitigation techniques for PowerSource and TextMate is forcing web traffic through a proxy. So not just for them, for any non-proxy aware piece of malware. That simple step of forcing the web traffic through a proxy can stop it in its tracks right there and can't go any further. So specifically for these pieces of malware, making sure you include DNS traffic and not allowing internet DNS resolution to ensure that that stays as it is.
Yep, so great mitigation. If you can't have a proxy, you're a small org. If you're collecting that command line info, again, looking for signs of obfuscation, little caret, quotation marks, may not get you everything, but might find some obfuscation. Also, again, restricting those policies. I don't think you can disable PowerShell in Windows anymore because it probably break a lot of things, but restrict so only admins can use PowerShell and only allow PowerShell to execute signed scripts. So one way you can kind of limit the attack surface the attackers can use for PowerShell.
Okay, so a tool out of the moving laterally component of the attacker lifecycle, PowerAdmin_exec, so or PAExec. It's functionally pretty darn similar to the sysinternal's PSexec. It supports execution of remote commands. However, it's interesting that FIN7 introduces this to the environment and uses it as their own tool rather than the native tool PAExec. So if PAExec for some reason is blocked in the environment and you can't use it, they've gotten around that by introducing this tool that functionally is the same thing but is slightly different. It's also cool because of the way that it runs. Most of the forensic artifacts are created on the source and not the target, so it's one of their ways of kind of covering their tracks and not being like as loud in the environment.
Yeah, and this is a great example of why you shouldn't just look for a specific tool, right? Because if you're just looking for PAExec, great, they use PAExec and you're screwed, right? So looking for the behaviors, right? So in attack, we call this service executions, how PAExec, how PAExec works. So looking for that behavior more generally.
So very specific mitigation and detection techniques. So FIN7 has been known to rename PAExec to logs 3 digits.exe. So specifically looking for that type of naming sequence is a very FIN7 specific way for detection, monitoring unusual executables running from C Windows temp. So not only have we seen PAExec executing from this directory, but we've seen FIN7 utilize this directory for other things. In the vast majority of cases, there's no reason for any executable to be running from your C Windows temp directory.
+1.
Yeah, so eliminating that is a good thing. FIN7 also only takes the single step of renaming the binary. That doesn't change a lot of the other metadata that's associated with that file, so looking for other components, and if your environment has that capability, looking for original file name and things of that nature can help be a detection mechanism.
I love that tip, right? If you're looking for certain things, maybe they change the file name, but they forget the others, adversaries screw up too, right?
Yeah. So moving into our complete mission phase of the attacker lifecycle. So Pillowment, we can't have a financial threat actor without going after some financial data. So Pillowment is a point-of-sale malware used to scrape track 1 and track 2 payment card data from memory. One of the cool things about Pillowment is that it identifies payment card data by doing small byte chunk comparisons in a memory region rather than using regex in order to find that payment card data. Once it identifies a numeric sequence, it then compares that to the LUN check, which anyone is familiar that helps to verify, is this a credit card number or payment card data number to that, and then they record that from memory at that point. So rather than using regex like so many tools do, it's kind of cool that they do that. So once they have their payment card data, what do they do with it? They encrypt it and store it in the registry often, and we also see it in plain text files. So beyond just scraping for payment card data, Pillowment has other backdoor capabilities too. So why not include all the capabilities in one tool if we're going to be there? So it can run processes, it can download and execute files, it can download and inject DLLs. It's kind of a full service backdoor beyond just the payment card data scraping capability. Pillowment also communicates with C2 servers over HTTP using AES encrypted messages. So we've seen them, so it actually sends payment card data back automatically over that channel in the environment.
Cool, so for the attack techniques, first one, data staged. Most adversaries, before they exfiltrate data, right, they put it somewhere. It may vary by adversary. Some put it in the recycle bin, some random temp or app data folder. Luckily, this varies by adversary and by malware, so luckily Regina's going to give you some sweet intel on where Pillowment stores this stuff that you can look for. So another remote file copy, downloading files, process injection. We have that's one technique right now, but to give you a little preview on where MITRE ATT&CK is going, in the coming months, we're actually going to divide techniques into sub-techniques. So for things like process injection, ton of ways to do this, right? DLL injection is one, so that's a little preview. Look for sub-techniques coming soon. Coming soon, TM. For command and control, again, standard application layer protocol, standard cryptographic protocol for the AES piece of the C2.
So mitigation and detection for Pillowment. I can't stress this enough. Point-to-point encryption and tokenization is definitely the way to go. I've been involved in multiple investigations of organizations in which FIN7 was successful with their initial compromise. They were successful establishing a foothold. They're successful moving around the environment, doing their reconnaissance, getting to the servers and the point-of-sale terminals that they wanted to be on. Everything except for being able to actually scrape payment card data because it was encrypted and tokenized. So while nothing else was mitigated or detected throughout the process, they were thwarted at the final stage because the data was actually protected. So I can't stress that enough. The use of data loss prevention software, so making sure data, even if it's not payment card data, whether it's PII, other important data from your environment that is properly protected and can't leave your environment at will, looking for RARs and zip files and other ways that attackers bundle up that information prior to taking out the environment. So implement specific registry keys. They're a huge fan of that TCP/IP parameters interfaces and then subkeys of that for storing commands that they're using or the actual payment card data right there in the registry. They're also a huge fan of that System32 sysfiles directory and using that directory for that plain text file and other like log files that they use in that environment.
Yeah, so I love these registry keys because they're specific, and when we were putting these slides together, I was like, BRB, like, need to go check some registry keys when I found out about these. So if you're a retail organization with financial data, like, maybe this is a slide to take a picture of and go check that at home. Cool. So now we walked through like all of these TTPs, all these behaviors of FIN7 and their malware. So what can we do with it? We talked a little bit at the beginning about the value of framework. So I want to walk through an example of how you could do this in practice using MITRE ATT&CK. So let's start. We've walked through all these attack techniques, mapped to the lifecycle as well. Here are the techniques we found for FIN7 in teal. This is all on our website. We use a lot of the FireEye blog posts, tweets, and other sources to get all this. It's important to say that this isn't all-encompassing. As MITRE, we don't see everything FIN7 is doing, so it's based on open source reporting. So that's a limitation, and if you yourself are tracking FIN7, what you could do is then go in here and add the techniques you know they're doing that aren't in open source, get a more complete picture of what the adversary is doing. Then what you can do from there, let's take another adversary, FIN8. In light blue are the techniques we've seen them do based on open source reporting. From there, you might be able to guess what I'm going to do. Wait for it. Overlay the two, right? In red are the techniques that, based on open source reporting, we've seen both groups do. So from there, if you're trying to prioritize based on your threat model, this is a way to do that. So often people talk about that, right? How do I actually prioritize based on what I know adversaries are doing? So this is one way you could go about that. And if these are the two groups you care most about, maybe start at those red techniques and start applying those to your defenses and seeing if you could detect those or protect against them. One step further, we gave you a lot of mitigation detection ideas today. So if you went through and mapped a specific tool, a specific data source, or your entire SOC capabilities to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, then you can overlay what you know you can detect or mitigate or protect with what you know adversaries are doing. That's threat-based defense if I've ever seen it, right? So many people throw around that term, and I think it's tough often when we write these reports to actually apply the threat intel to our defenses. So once you've structured your intel, it's so much easier to do that and say, hey, I evaluated my SOC. These are the techniques that we can't detect at all, and I know FIN7 and FIN8 are doing. So let's prioritize, let's fill those gaps, right? That's what it's all about. Probably no one's going to be able to detect everything FIN7 ever does across the attack lifecycle or MITRE ATT&CK, but it's all about making improvements, right? Getting better as the adversaries improve. So in conclusion, frameworks are useful. I hope we've made that pitch to you. I believe that. Regina believes that. That's why we teamed up today. Regardless of whether you choose the attack lifecycle or MITRE ATT&CK, organize your threat intel, organize what you know about adversaries, and that'll make the rest of these things much easier for you. And consider what your use case is. Are you looking for a granular level of detail? Are you looking for the general order in which adversaries do things? But you don't have to choose. You can use them both.
I think we would suggest you use them both.
I would, yeah.
Yeah. So kind of wrapping up, 2 major points for FIN7. I feel like FIN7 has been so successful because of their use of social engineering and their well-disguised lures. They're very, very professional, and they're very, very good about getting in their environment. FIN7 continues to be successful because they're constantly adapting and evolving in order to prevent detection. So being able to be on that cutting edge and paying attention to what's going on in the environment is very, very important, because they're always there trying to re-obfuscate something differently, trying to get around some sort of mechanism. Being diligent is super, super important. And then for the best chance of detecting FIN7, of course, we're going to tell you to look across their attack lifecycle and look at the attack techniques that are associated with them. These are things that historically they've been really good at, but knowing that that's not the end-all, be-all. It is a starting point. These are living documents and should always be updated as soon as more information becomes available.
Cool. Some additional resources. Lots more info on a MITRE attack is available at attack.mitre.org. I'll tell you, because this isn't being live broadcast, we're moving to a new website. Styx taxi-based website. The current website's MediaWiki, so that's fun. It was a small team. It worked at the time. Now we're reaching our teenage years. Not so cool. So in the next week or so, we should be releasing a beta of that new website for folks to kind of kick the tires on, give us feedback before we transition to it. And we have FIN7 and a whole bunch of other groups mapped on attack.
Some more information on FIN7. We only went over a handful of techniques today in order to show that mapping to the MITRE framework. But if you want to deep dive into these things, the hunt for FIN7 is a super good blog post that came out about a month or so ago. And it's very detailed on more of the recent activity of what's going on with FIN7. And then a recent podcast that came out by FireEye, tracking the cybercrime group, FireEye at a Glance, is also a really good conversational discussion about FIN7 activity today.
And there's a great podcast that just came out on Saturday. It was good Saturday afternoon listening, Cyberwire with Nick Carr and Barry V. Another good source of FIN7 info. And I guess we should both say, you know, talking about Nick and Barry, like, thank you to all of our teams. You know, we don't do all this work ourselves, obviously. I know FireEye has tons of people working on FIN7, tons of people work on MITRE ATT&CK. So thank you to our teams for all of the work that made it possible for us to brief you today.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think we actually have time for questions. So if you want to grab a beer and ask questions, I'll be hanging around having a beer as well.
Great. Yeah, so if anybody has questions, please make your way to the mic. And while we're waiting for people to do that, Regina, am I remembering correctly that Pillow Mint was actually named by you? Some of you may not know that as a consultant, if you come across new malware, often you get to influence the name.
Yeah, I was the original person to discover Pillow Mint and got the distinct honor of being able to name it. So it was.
So why Pillow Mint?
Hospitality. It was a. I mean, one of. It was one of.
Pillow? Yeah,
it was one of FIN7 targets hospitality and restaurants predominantly. They have other industries they target as well. But that particular piece of malware was first discovered at a hospitality client, and it was a nice little gift there. So Pillow Mint.
Excellent. Oh my gosh. Great. Looks like we do have a question over here.
Sweet.
Yeah, hi. Good afternoon. Thanks for the great presentation. I was following earlier today the discussion on Platinum, the one on APT38. I've had kind of like the same question I asked earlier around the command shell, the PowerShell all being spawned. We know most normal users are not going to be running them and running netstats and IP configs and things like that all day long. I think where my question's going now is the earlier groups that were being discussed have kind of gotten away, if I was hearing right, from actually spawning the command or PowerShell and more incorporating code that would pull the same recon data without having that telltale giveaway that was spawned. Do you think that what you know of FIN7, it sounds like right now they're still doing it a little bit old school. Do you think that they're good enough to see them evolve in a way where they would move away from that?
Yeah, absolutely. I would describe FIN7 as basically a financial threat group that has more or less nation-state capability and in tactic and technique. They're constantly developing new ways of doing these things, and we do see them use backdoors that have a lot of these capabilities already in their own backdoor. So, yeah.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, they'll be as bad as or they'll do as much as they need to get into an environment. And once we start making it hard for them, that's when they'll start increasing.
FIN7
yes.
is definitely ruthless.
Hello. Hey, big fan. Question.
This is not a plant, I swear.
Question about the legitimate services stuff. You said that's under like MITRE ATT&CK, like just the application layer access. Like, what's the best way to share publicly or with MITRE directly to share like a whole category? Because we are seeing like an uptick of legitimate services C2. We have someone focusing on finding that kind of stuff. Just found some like Tumblr C2 this week, and it almost deserves its own category, but it's hard to figure out like what's the best way to share that, but then have that data accessible by the community.
Well, thank you so much for asking. attack@mitre.org, that's our email address. We are trying to rack our brains for like a better way to have people contribute, like a GitHub thing. It's so tough because the process that we go through of like adding new techniques, like we argue a whole lot on Slack about it, and then we like try to find threat reports and talk to people and ask people like you guys, are you seeing this in the wild? So how do you put that in GitHub? I don't know. So for right now, it's email us at attack@mitre.org. We have a contribution document on our website about what we're looking for with new technique contributions, but we're always looking for that. The first question we'll ask is there a report on an adversary use in the wild? Not a requirement. If there's like a really advanced red team who's picked it up, we'll consider adding it because, as you could explain to us right now, red team stuff adversaries pick up very quickly. Hey, if you tweet, we'll also cite that on our website. Yeah. So you can reach out to us via Twitter DM. Anyway, but yeah, as I said, like we rely on your work, we rely on FireEye, we rely on other companies and researchers because we don't see all the adversaries. So email, we're working on a better solution.
Great, thanks, Nick. One last question, or at least from myself, unless we have other people come up. Are you seeing anybody using the framework to also simulate the offensive side for pen testing purposes? They want to do something that looks like FIN7 in an environment. Are they leveraging the attack framework to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Adversary emulation, simulation, huge field right now. There are a couple of vendors who kind of map to attack for that type of automated red teaming. Didn't have time to get into it, but MITRE, my teammates, Blake leads a project called Caldera, which is an automated red teaming tool that maps to attack. We've also released adversary emulation plans. Right now, just one for APT3 based on historic reporting. The idea there is to kind of enable red teamers to act like a group, or the historical reporting on a group, which is the best we have, to try to give a more realistic kind of red team type perspective. So lots of tools and teams who are doing that. So red teamers, happy to chat offline. Didn't have time to get into that, but yeah, a lot of people using attack for red team, EDR. It's everywhere right now. It's exciting.
Great.